The Greek miracle was a complete fraud. Let's cut the crap. For centuries, they've been feeding you a story, a bedtime story for Western civilization. It's called the Greek miracle, and you've been swallowing it whole since your first history class. They told you that on a tiny peninsula in the Mediterranean, a handful of men named Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates woke up one day and just invented thinking. That Pythagoras single-handedly discovered the secret code of the universe in his sleep. That from the minds of these men, and these men alone, sprang forth the columns, the temples, the philosophy, and the democracy that would define the entire world. They want you to believe that the foundation of everything we call modern was a spontaneous explosion of European genius. But tonight, we're going to burn that bedtime story to the ground. Because the truth is, the Greek miracle is one of the most successful, most insidious, and most carefully crafted marketing campaigns in human history. It's a fraud, and the legacy they claim as their own, it was stolen. For far too long, we've been told this lie that all human progress began with this one miraculous civilization. But the evidence, the truth they tried to bury, tells a story of a massive intellectual heist. So today, we pull back the curtain. We expose the con. We are taking back a stolen legacy. Now, let's be crystal clear. The fraud isn't that the Greeks didn't achieve greatness. The Parthenon is a marvel. Plato's Republic is a masterpiece. We're not here to tear down their accomplishments. We're here to tear down the lie about where those accomplishments came from. The lie is the story of immaculate conception, the racist, arrogant fantasy that these ideas erupted from a European vacuum, with no parents, no ancestors, and no darker-skinned teachers. Mainstream history sells you this bill of goods, that the Greeks were the first to leap from mythology to pure reason. But what if I told you that the blueprints for their miracle were already ancient, and they weren't written in Greek? The funny thing is, the ancient Greeks were far more honest about their sources than the modern historians who claim to speak for them. The historian Herodotus, the philosopher Plato, one after another, they wrote with the deepest reverence about an older, wiser civilization they had to travel to in order to learn. That civilization was Egypt. They openly admitted, they bragged, that their wisdom came from the priests and scholars of Africa, from the banks of the Nile. Yet, over the past few centuries, this truth, what scholars call the ancient model, was systematically buried. It was erased and replaced by a new, whitewashed story. A story that centered a pure, white, European Greece as the solitary cradle of genius. And you have to stop and ask yourself a very simple question. Why? Why would they work so hard to scrub Africa out of the story? We'll get to that. First, let's follow the money. Let's follow the receipts they tried to shred. Let's start with a name they made sure you knew. Pythagoras. The man, the myth, the theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's the jewel in the crown of Greek mathematical genius. But this is Exhibit A in the grand larceny case. Archaeologists have dug up Babylonian clay tablets, like the infamous Plimpton 322, that date back to 1800 BCE. Let me say that again, 1800 years before Christ. That's over a full millennium, before Pythagoras was a twinkle in his father's eye. And these tablets aren't just scribbles, they contain lists of what we now call Pythagorean triples. The Babylonians knew the principle, and they used it for complex land surveying. They weren't waiting for a Greek to tell them how the world worked. And what about the original architects of ancient grandeur? The Egyptians used the exact same principle to build the pyramids, using simple knotted ropes to form perfect 3-4-5 right triangles. They applied the theorem in the real world to build monuments that still humble us today. So what was the Greek contribution? They created a formal, abstract proof for it. That is a brilliant achievement, no doubt. But was it an invention? Was it a miracle? Hell no. It was the elegant packaging of a much older, deeper knowledge. They didn't write the song, they just made one hell of a remix, and then scratched the original artist's name off the record. If math was borrowed, then what about philosophy? This is the supposed soul of the Greek miracle. We're taught it all began with Thales, Plato, and Socrates asking the big questions for the very first time. What is justice? What is reality? What is a good life? But were they really the first? Again, the Greeks themselves point us back to Kemet, back to ancient Egypt. It's well documented that early Greek thinkers like Thales and Pythagoras spent years studying in Egypt. Even Plato's own work references Egypt as a source of ancient wisdom. And when you look at the ideas themselves, the similarities aren't just powerful, they're a smoking gun. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the divine principle of order, truth, and cosmic justice, bears an undeniable resemblance to Plato's theories on the ideal state and cosmic order. Does that sound like a coincidence to you? Egyptian wisdom literature, which offered moral instruction on living a virtuous life, existed for centuries, and was almost certainly studied by the Greek philosophers who traveled there. And the Egyptian understanding of the soul, the Ba, and its eternal journey after death, It's the blueprint for the Pythagorean and Platonic ideas of the immortal soul that became central to Western thought. The Greek genius was not in inventing these concepts, but in systematizing them, building a rigid logical framework around them. But the seeds, the foundational ideas of justice, the cosmos, and the soul, those seeds were first planted and watered in the fertile soil of the Nile Valley. Now, picture those magnificent Greek temples, those powerful Doric columns, the beautiful Ionic scrolls. Surely, this was a uniquely Greek invention. But look closer. It's when the Greeks start having consistent contact with Egypt around 650 BCE that their art and architecture suddenly explode. It wasn't a miracle, it was inspiration. They saw the colossal stone temples of the Egyptians and were utterly transformed. You want proof? Look at the early Greek Kouros statues, those famous stiff figures of young men. They are practically carbon copies of the rigid, foot-forward pose of Egyptian pharaonic sculptures. It was a direct artistic lift. The influence on their temples is even more obvious. The entire concept of using massive, load-bearing columns to create a sense of scale and divine grandeur was pioneered in Egypt. Karnak had a forest of stone columns before the first Greek temple was even a blueprint. The Greeks refined this language, creating their own distinct and beautiful dialects, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. But the fundamental architectural grammar, the post and lintel system, the use of columns for grandeur, even decorative motifs like the lotus flower was a language they learned from Egypt. They saw what was possible in Africa, and created their own magnificent variation on a theme. But the original sheet music was written 1,000 years earlier, in stone. So if the foundations of their miracle were borrowed, where did the Greeks consolidate all this plundered knowledge? The answer is probably the most famous, and most tragic, intellectual treasure house in history, the Library of Alexandria. Built in Egypt, but under Greek rule, it became the single greatest collection of scrolls in the ancient world. But how did they get all those books? It was a state-sponsored campaign of aggressive, intellectual appropriation. The Greek Ptolemaic dynasty sent agents across the known world to buy or copy every single manuscript they could get their hands on. They even had a law: any ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor had to surrender its books. The library would then copy them, keeping the priceless originals and returning a cheap copy to the owners. This place was a melting pot, holding works from across the world, but its foundation was built upon the immense intellectual wealth of Egypt itself. The library wasn't just a beacon of Greek intellect, it was the final stage of a massive knowledge transfer. It was the hoarding of an African legacy by a new European power. So, let's go back to the beginning. Was the Greek miracle a complete fraud? Yes. The story, they sold you, is a fraud. The relationship wasn't a miracle, it was an inheritance. The Greeks were brilliant heirs who received a massive intellectual estate, and then conveniently erased the name of the benefactor from the will. They stood on the shoulders of African and Mesopotamian giants, and then had the audacity to crop them out of the photograph of history. And now we come back to that crucial question: why? Why was the picture doctored? Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, as European powers were carving up the globe and colonizing black and brown people, they needed a history to justify it. They needed a narrative that made Europe the sole source of all progress, and Africa a continent of no history. The work of scholars like Martin Bernal, in his groundbreaking book Black Athena, ripped the lid off this conspiracy, arguing that the honest, ancient model of Egyptian influence was deliberately suppressed for racist and ideological reasons. Acknowledging this truth doesn't diminish Greece. It makes their story richer, more complex, and more honest. It makes it part of a human story, not a racial one. Civilization is a relay race, not a sprint. The baton of knowledge is passed from one hand to the next. The Greeks ran a phenomenal leg of that race, but they damn sure didn't start on the starting block. They were handed the baton by Africa. This lie about the Greek miracle is just one of the official stories we've been sold. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What happens to a people, to their descendants, when their ancestors' greatest achievements are stolen and sold back to them as the product of another race? What other giants have been erased from our history books to make others look taller? Question everything. Dig deeper. The real story of humanity is always more tangled, more connected, and infinitely more interesting than the simple, sanitized myths they feed us in school. What other part of our history needs to be reclaimed from the thieves? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready to keep uncovering the truths that history class left out, make sure you subscribe.